For waiting, we would like to start the symposium sponsored by the Century Foundation entitled The New Bridge Across the Pacific. We thank each and every one of you for joining us in spite of your very busy schedule. I will be your moderator. I am Sano from the Century Foundation. Before the start of the International Symposium, the president of the Century Foundation, Mr. Saji, was supposed to greet you, but it just so happened that he is also serving as the president of the Osaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the former chairman, Mr. Sahiki's funeral is being held today, so he had to attend the funeral. So we do hope you will forgive us that he will not be able to attend today's symposium. From the Century Foundation, Mr. Tori, one of our directors, will greet you at the outset of the symposium. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am from the Century Foundation, one of the directors. Tori is my name. On behalf of our president, Mr. Saji, let me greet each and every one of you. At the outset of this international symposium, we would like to express our heartfelt appreciation for all of you for joining us in spite of your very busy schedules. With your great interest, we have been able to hold the symposium. I pay my greatest respect to all of you, and I feel very much the great hopes and expectations that are attached to this symposium. For this international symposium, we have from across the Pacific a distinguished lineup of guests from Harvard University, Professor Emeritus Professor Daniel Bell. We also have from Harvard University, Professor Roderick MacArthur. And from Columbia University, we have the Professor Emeritus, Professor Herbert Passon. And to all of our foreign guests, we would like to express our appreciation. Our Century Foundation aims at contributing to the development of academic and research activities around the world. And in 1979, celebrating the 80th anniversary of Century, we decided to establish this foundation. Today, this international symposium will be held in commemoration of the 10th anniversary of the inception of the Century Foundation. Looking back a decade ago, the role of Japan in the world was taken up in the symposium entitled Japan Speaks. And this started the activities of the Century Foundation. At that time, too, we had Dr. Daniel Bell come all the way across the Pacific to join us. And today, from Kyoto University, we have Professor Kosaka. From Osaka University, we have Professor Yamazaki. And from these gentlemen, over the past decade, we have received their kindest cooperation and guidance and advice. In 1983, in New York, we held a symposium. At that time, the symposium was 1970s, the turning point of Japan-US relationships in the post-industrial age. And then once again, we have come across the Pacific to look at Japan in Asia in a new era. Looking at current Japan-US relations, we find that it is not a favorable relationship as we have seen in the past. To try to take up the issue of Japan-US relations in a new era is of global importance. On this side of the Pacific, by looking at the issues of Asia, the role of Japan will become increasingly clear. The title of this symposium is The New Bridge Across the Pacific. In English, A New Bridge Across the Pacific. Now, this bridge across the Pacific was a terminology coined by Mr. Inazo Nitobe, whose portrait is depicted on the 5,000 yen bill. He was instrumental in conveying Western thought to Japan and Japanese thought to the West, and he himself aspired to be a bridge across the Pacific. And he dedicated himself and his life to internationalization of Japan and the world. We will be looking at the new bridge across the Pacific, whether Japan can serve to be the bridge between the East and the West. And with such expectations and hope, I would like to end my brief greetings to you. I thank you once again for coming in spite of the very early hours. Thank you very much.
それでは本日の Now then, may we introduce the panelists. We are starting from your left to your right. Professor Herbert Passin, Professor Emeritus of the Columbia University. Professor Passin is a sociologist, was lived in Japan for many, many years. He has his hands-on experience with the Japan-US relationship. Next to him is the president of Japan Center for Economic Research, Professor Taka Kosai. Professor Kosai came from the Economic Planning Agency originally. He's a leading famous economist. He has written books about the overview of the Japanese economy, for which he received the first Suntory Foundation Prize. Next to him is Professor Emeritus of the Harvard University, Professor Daniel Bell. Professor Bell wrote books like The End of an Ideology, The Post-Industrial Society, and others. A very well-known sociologist from the United States. He has participated in our series of symposiums from the very beginning. We are very appreciative of him. Then in the middle is Professor Masataka Kosaka of the University of Kyoto. Professor Kosaka needs little introduction. He's a leading political scientist, international political scientist, who will be speaking this morning as a keynote speaker. Next is Mr. Yoichi Funabashi, a member of the editorial board of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. Mr. Funabashi, as a journalist, spent years in Beijing and Washington. He has written books called Nave about China, for which he is also recipient of 1985 Suntory Foundation Prize. Professor Roderick McFarker of the Harvard University. Professor McFarker served as a member of the British Parliament, and is a very well-known sinologist or China expert. He'll be speaking in the afternoon session. He has just contributed to the magazine Asteon, the latest issue, copies of which are available for your purchase just outside of this hall. He carries an interesting article about the Tiananmen incident and its aftermath. Finally, but not last, our coordinator, Professor Masakazu Yamazaki of Osaka University. Professor Yamazaki is a very active man, playwright, literary critic, social commentator, among other things. Recently at the Globe Theatre in Shinjuku, he produced a musical of all things, that We Saw Rome. Very, very famous piece. Professor Yamazaki. Good morning, friends. Thank you for joining us. The theme of our discussion today is New Bridge, talking about New Bridge over the Pacific Ocean. As you heard Mr. Tori earlier, at the beginning of our century, 20th century, Dr. Nitobe, Inazo Nitobe, wanted to call himself actually the bridge over the Pacific. That's what inspired us in titling this symposium. Dr. Nitobe, in his heart, felt that Japan should become the bridge over the Pacific, and he wanted to see Japan become one. But as we convene this symposium today, are we really sure that Japan can be indeed a bridge over the Pacific, or should be the Pacific bridge over the Pacific? No, we are not so arrogant as to assume that we can. But in fact, there is an invisible bridge being structured, being built over the Pacific. That is our perception. That is the starting point of a symposium. We all know well of the importance of the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Basin area, increasingly important as we move toward the end of the 20th century. First, this nation of the United States of America, betwixt the two major oceans of the Atlantic and the Pacific, is shifting its center of economic gravity, so to speak, toward the western part of the United States, west coast. Of course, industrial development has been faster on the west coast, and the U.S. has had closer dealing with Japan and the rest of Asia, making the United States more and more of a Pacific nation. At the same time, with Australia and the other nations in the Asian Pacific region, there is a growing degree of interdependence from Europe, as in the past. These nations are becoming Pacific nations. Japan, on its part, and the so-called newly industrializing economies are increasing their economic strength. So thereby we are witnessing a sort of two economic giants, the Asian Pacific to the west and the United States in the east. In fact, we need more than one bridge, not just Japan and the United States. We need US-China, US vis-a-vis other Asian nations. We are witnessing this construction of multiple bridges across this Pacific. Crossing the ocean with bridges means people communicate with each other. People get to know each other. At the same time, it also means that there are difficulties that travel also over these bridges. And as to what these difficulties are, you know probably already full well. Our concern, our interest is how to keep these bridges intact or in place in good working orders, keeping them useful to the entire humanity. Also, the prosperity of the Pacific should not impair other regions or nations in the world. It should not be detrimental to the well-being of nations other than those in the Pacific and Asia. We like to, with some literary license, make these bridges global bridges, not just exclusively Pacific and Asian. In the morning, we'll hear from Professor Kosaka about various aspects of the Japan-United States issues. All the participants will join in discussing this theme. In the afternoon, we start with Professor McFarcart, who will present the keynote talk, mainly on the question of China. And we'll have discussions among us panelists. After the break in the afternoon, we try to combine both the messages or the input of the morning sessions and afternoon sessions for comprehensive discussion. It's going to be a long day, but I do hope you will participate with us with enthusiasm. With that, I invite Professor Kosaka to speak for 40 or 50 minutes. Professor Kosaka. Thank you. These days, Japan-US relationships have become major concerns on both sides of the Pacific. We have probably the most difficult time after the Pacific War. There is not a small danger that it may get worse. It is strange, come to think of it. The Cold War is over, and the US-led international economic order has more or less covered at least the entire world. The American dream has been materialized pretty substantially. Then, at such a time, there should be such name callings and confrontations. It is strange to me. As a subjective matter, there are problems, no question about it. Japan-US trade imbalance is colossal, and America and the United States has a major balance of international payments deficit, much of which is due to Japan-US dealings, which cannot be left unattended for a long time. Having said that, let me say that so far I've spoken of the objective facts. But today, Japan and United States are busying ourselves, it seems to me, calling each other names, blaming each other. The Americans think the Japanese are closed in market and exclusive, so they criticize. And the Japanese criticize Americans for low saving rate and budget deficits. These arguments are partially correct, well-founded. Mutual critiquing certainly is necessary, desirable. But are we engaging ourselves in a productive debate? I doubt that. Seriously. This is the case as I see it. So, how do we interpret the present US-Japan relationship is my theme. My approach, therefore, is necessarily an intellectual one. This morning, as I woke up, I was only half asleep. I walked out to the door without carrying the key with me. I went to the lobby and had to beg for another key. And I took a wrong lift or the wrong elevator. Professor Bell just happened to join me. And I said to him, I do this very often. Professor Bell said, he was talking about the swimming. When somebody asks you, can you swim? I would say, I would swim, but I know the theory about swimming. That's how he would answer. So someone answered, according to Professor Bell. For us in the academia, in the universities, we don't know how to solve the problems, but I think we have some theories to put forward to. So I did make a faux pas this morning, and I borrow Professor Bell's words. So I don't know how to solve the problems, but I can put forward some set of theories, which is what I'm going to do now. 3 theories there are. 1, about the difference. How do we interpret this difference? 2nd, at the present, the situation we are in may be perceived globally and in historical context. Then, what are the facts that we should see as taking place in reality, the perception? 3, foreign relations, diplomatic policies. What are they for? What can they accomplish? That's my 3rd topic. Let me take them up one by one. Recently, there is a growing body of criticism in the United States among the Americans, with the perception that Japan is different in many ways from all other industrial nations. I have little to add here, but we Japanese too tend to think that the Japanese and Americans are quite different. The only difference is the Americans speak up of this difference. We Japanese don't. That's the difference. Criticisms about Japan are legion. The government, private sector collusion designed to conquer the world. And nobody knows who makes up the decisions. Somehow, collectively, entire Japan is pursuing its national interest. And given the structure of Japan, Japan is not an open nation, so goes the argument. I cannot deny all these arguments, and I don't intend to. But this theory that Japan is different should not be overemphasized. There's a great danger in overemphasizing these differences. And I don't think they will stand a detailed analysis, actually. So let me give you an example or two. This argument about Japan being different was quite active as an argument 70, 80 years ago. What was called different was, I think the only difference was Germany and America were considered so different. In the 70s, as I said, some 70 years old, there was that kind of argument. Let me give you another example. In France, there's André Sigrid, a well-known journalist in France. In his the age of the American age, he wrote in his concluding part, which I quote generally. Americans are today now creating on a vast scale an entire regional social structure which bears only a superficial resemblance to the European. Many of the most magnificent material achievements of the United States have been made mostly by sacrificing certain rights of the individual rights which we of the old world regard as among the most precious victories of civilization. This is from the Age of America under Siegfried. This was in reference, in fact, to the mass production system that began to be developed in America. Andre Siegfried actually slipped his tongue and overstated the case. He said, as this mass production goes on, the rights of the individuals may be infringed upon. In this, America will be unique, different. Europeans will be closer, more similar to Asians. Therefore, dialogue needs to take place between Ford and Gandhi, he said. This part, I would say, he got a little carried over. I would like to forget that. I think it's all right to forget that part. But this outstanding journalist, even this outstanding journalist, said that much, Andre Siegfried. But today, America has not seized its difference. Some people do indicate that America is different, but people don't think America's problem is its difference from the rest of the world. Economic historians today consider that successes of America and Germany cannot be explained by the differences with the rest of the world. Certain degrees of universality should indeed be the key to analyzing or explaining American and German successes.
The reason why I bring out such historical examples is to show that there were overreactions on the part of the people in the past, too. As for Germany, I will not specifically make any quotations, but the difference of Germany was brought about according to the critiques of that time, that they had a special machinery which allowed for economic growth to go on at alarming speeds. So during the past, the United States and West Germany were cited to be different. And looking back, although not completely unuseful, we can say that it was rather off the mark. I do not want to go into more detail about this, but if we think about the successes of Japan, we have to think about to what degree the difference of Japan has contributed to the success. First of all, I must mention that there was the latecomer's benefit or advantage on the part of Japan. Japan received a technical transfer from the United States, and she successfully absorbed and digested this. When it comes to training and education of the workers, the American mode of placing a great amount of its importance on management towards these aspects was very much emphasized. This also was a latecomer's advantage. The next comes good fortunes. And what I would like to mention under good luck was the fact that military expenditure in Japan was kept low, and that public expenditure on the part of Japan compared to the other advanced industrialized countries were rather small. These two factors are not necessarily linked to each other, but in any event, Japan was able to have small and cheap government, no doubt about that. So when we look at these facts in the 1960s, Japan's governmental expenditure was less than half than that of European nations and approximately 60% that of the United States. Now, I call this good fortune, and there may be some criticism about that. The fact that Japan was able to keep her military expenditure low could be said to be of good policy, but I say that this was due to simple good luck that Japan did not have to expend large monies for military purposes. One perhaps can say that the other countries were less fortunate. So this was a matter of good luck and not a matter of being different. Furthermore, as to the other aspects of good fortunes, we found that large numbers of small-medium enterprises in Japan becoming very dynamic in the 1970s. But once again here, when I was in the university, we often took up this issue of the small-medium enterprises as constituting a dual structure of the economy. What used to be a burden suddenly one day became an asset, so to speak. And once again, I cannot help but say that this was good luck. It seems like good fortune seemed to play a very large role in the fortunes of a country. But the greatest luck was that The oil crisis of the 1960s brought about consensus on the part of the Japanese citizenry and gave a goal to which the Japanese people strenuously tried to attain. At the beginning, of course, we didn't think that this was good luck, but it was a blessing in disguise, so to speak. I say this was good fortunes on the part of Japan because at that time, energy conservation, materials conservation, or new electronic technology increasingly became more widespread. And right at the time when such technological innovation was becoming increasingly disseminated, Japan was able to switch her industrial structure to a new kind of a structure, which was more energy saving. So for my third point, as to the success of Japan, we can say that Japan was able to successfully cope with the calls of the day. Now, what is left would then be the difference of Japan. As for such differences, for example, the close cooperation between the public sector and the private sector and the export policy that resulted thereof, or the in-house unions and lifetime employment system, which made such unions possible, have been listed. The stability and the relative long-term time horizons adopted by the management would be another factor, or the close sense of relationship and loyalty that has been bred by a feudalistic sort of orientation. But to these points too, I must mention that whether these factors are completely not found abroad, perhaps a detailed analysis would show that in the same manner we cannot find the exact same equivalent, but when it comes to thrift and exerting great amount of efforts towards industrialization, all countries have to go through that phase. Even Haldun, a very famous, should I say, Arabian man of thought, took up this issue of the rise and fall of the nations, and he said that when countries are on the rise, diligence and good amount of effort would be critical. So I think this would be a common feature amongst all countries. So to a considerable degree, what was often cited to be different aspects of Japan is merely an issue of time lag. If I can explain that with the success of industrialization, such elements will increasingly disappear and they will not be sustained forever. As for the long-term time horizon of the Japanese management, 2 decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago, perhaps that was the case. But recently, when I look at the Japanese companies, I cannot feel that they have a long-term perspective. The Japanese people are still very diligent, but maybe 20 years, 30 years henceforward, the situation would change. So what I think is important along this line is the fact that due to the defeat of the war, that there has been a complete cutoff from the pre-war mentality, and that an atmosphere that everyone must try hard for the collective good, not in the pre-war form of virtue, but a new kind of virtue was continued to be seen here in this country. In this connection, let me mention about an American man of thought, Mr. Veblen. And Mr. Veblen in 1915 mentioned about the opportunity of Japan. In this thesis, Mr. Veblen mentioned that Japan was industrially very strong, but the strength of Japan was due to feudalistic virtues still remaining, and that through industrialization, she succeeded materialistic, and that came together in a synergistic manner to make for the strength of Japan. Furthermore, Veblen goes on to say that these kind of situations are seen in the European countries, that perhaps the degree of success was rather remarkable in the case of Japan, but it was not unique to Japan. The fact that Japan succeeded in her industrialization was the fact that it proved the commonality in the basics involved. For example, the fact that Japan went through a feudalistic era, or that in Japan there was a subtle but a very evident manner of coping with diversity. And in the ancient age, this was arrived from the fact that many peoples came to Japan and there was a lot of cultural exchange with other countries, common also with the European countries. So same kinds of facts can be seen in the same context, and if one does that kind of an exercise, one arrives at the same conclusion. That's what Dr. Veblen mentioned. For Japan to further promote industrialization, it was mentioned that sooner or later, such feudalistic virtues would become weakened and disappear, that human relations are bound to change. Why is this? Because industrialization needs a certain degree of communications, needs a certain level of education, and needs a certain amount of autonomy and independence. And once you go in the process of industrialization, such unique culmination of several factors cannot continue forever. This opportunity of Japan, this title itself indicates that Japan in the long term would become an ordinary country, a commonplace country, but that maybe over a century or so, Japan would be able to draw upon her feudalistic virtues and the industrialization process. And I found Dr. Veblen's thesis very interesting. Perhaps Dr. Bell would be a better person to mention about this, but Saint-Simon also has mentioned about this. Comte Saint-Simon mentioned, and Comte mentioned this. Overall, I think the situation in Japan can be mentioned to a large degree by time lag. So in any event, such unique or different aspects will not go on forever, and over a very long time span, issues that we cannot think can be immediately resolved of can, in the final analysis, be overcome. Then, to what degree can industrial societies move in the same direction? What kind of time lags are involved? And what would be the last remaining differences or uniqueness? That, I think, is an interesting intellectual exercise. I think something will remain, but what that something would be is a very important intellectual point of thought. Let me go on to my second point.
The question of this difference cannot be denied totally. I approve of it in part, but more importantly, I do see the present problems as arising from the massive set of changes since the 1970s, which have created the problems that we have today. What are these colossal massive changes? I still don't know, to be frank. I can point out a few things, e.g. the oil shock or oil crisis and massive energy saving efforts that pursued. In the case of Japan, this had twofold impact. On Japan, first, imports expanded because of the oil crisis. And as the imports rose, we had to finance them by stepping up our exports. So we had increased our exports. You know full well that after the Second World War and through 1980s, the exports as a share of GNP was around 13%. Pretty much constant for these ages. Then in 1986, it rose to 17.5%, a 4 percentage point increase. So this change is quite significant. Prior thereto, in 1980, imports rose by about 3%. So in this sense, because of the expensive energy imports, Japan had to make extra efforts to finance them. This was a major motivating factor. However, since then, as we succeeded in energy saving efforts, the oil price came down, and even before they began coming down, the prices of raw materials, natural resources were generally tending downward anyway. Perhaps as technologies are developed, we human beings are becoming less, in fact, and less on natural resources. For Japan, was it good luck? It was a good luck. Perhaps it was too much of a good luck. we had anticipated energy prices would continue to be high, so we stepped our exports and energy prices came down. Thus, we generated huge surpluses in trade, on the trade account. In this sense, the relationship between resources and the real economy have changed. The same thing worked in a negative way to the Americans. America does not export oil, but it does export much primary commodities, agricultural products and so on. Their prices came down too. When Japan was spending less and less, when at the same time Americans were expending more and more, earning less and less. That was a misfortune for Americans. At that time, triggered by the so-called oil dollar or whatever, there began to arise a major change in the world financial circles or financial scene. The financial system institution in the world had to be maintained by the Americans, which ended up rather costly. Please recall that 13 some years ago, right after oil shock, recycling was the greatest concern to all of us. If recycling wasn't done well, the world will plunge into depression. We will argue, concerned about that. But that did not take place because in America, the banks saw to it that money be recycled. But some money ended up in not economically efficient ways. The upshot was what happened in Latin America, accumulated massive debt. Latin America, as you know, is an important export market for American industrial products. America, therefore, had to live with reduced earnings, export earnings in Latin America. Japan is surrounded by needs. Frankly speaking, the Japanese had not expected the needs to come to the fore some 20 years ago. So we have a big happy surprise, a new market. So this needs constitutes a third important matter of good luck. This decade of the 1970s, in another important way, was a decade when the Soviet power began expanding in the latter half of the decade. In 1979, the Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan. In retrospect, how silly was it? They did something utterly unnecessary, we would always argue. But what I like to emphasize is that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and the United States didn't do anything to prevent it actually. And the Soviets learned their own, would the Soviets still have learned their folly if the Americans didn't do anything? But then this would be too much to expect of the humanity. The Soviet expansion was something that the Japanese and the Europeans certainly had to cope with. If the Russians had taken different course of policy action in the 70s, the world affairs may have been smoother. Well, there's no crying over the split milk. But anyway, the Americans had to spend far more to check the Russians in Afghanistan. That ended up very costly to all of us. So that was, and up until now is the closing phase of the age of the Cold War. So as we look back into the 1970s, neither was Japan a villain, nor was America. But there were a set of drastic changes which worked in favor of the Japanese economy and in disfavor of the American economy. That, I think, is the bottom line. There are inequalities, unfairness in the affairs of men and women. These things do happen. I have just drawn a very quick sketch of what has taken place in the world as I saw it. But these are things we have to keep in mind. But what I have mentioned is not very comprehensive because in the meanwhile, during this period, the role of governments has been changing too. The nature of the government's work has been changing. Deregulations, for example. But these are very hard to define. How are governments in various nations changing? This is a very slippery, elusive animal. What I want to emphasize is, in about the middle of the 1970s, people in those days thought with the energy crisis and stagflation, and on top of it, mounting Russian threat. These to the people in the 70s were the major concerns they argued. Most people had agreed to them, or at least didn't raise any questions. But these problems have been rather neatly solved. That should give us some sense of confidence. However, we have dealt with them pretty neatly, but at some considerable cost to the Americans. And we have not completed our adjustment with all these changes. We have a lot more homework to do. That is my reading of the present situation. I wanted to give as an example the changes over the last few decades, and I submit it is important to exercise intellectually what are the problems, nature of the problems, or what are the importances. I'm no one to say that I'm the one who can offer the neatest blueprints for our intellectual exercise, but this type of perception of the reality is important for both the Japanese and Americans, because between our two peoples there are a lot of noises, arguments. While the situation has changed so drastically, we seem to be still employing the old frame of reference, an intellectual error. An error in intellectual exercise. For example, in the 1970s, let's say there was no trade imbalance between our two countries. Let's say the governments have liberalized their institutions, and still there are imbalances. And therefore, some argue the Americans are to blame. Some people do that. Statistically, this argument may be supported by figures. However, if we all agree that there were indeed massive changes in the 70s, we should first and foremost address ourselves to these problems instead of blaming unilaterally America, without understanding why America had taken some of the policy that it had. Now, on the Americans. The kinds of rules that prevailed in the past could stay, and if, in other words, we have some return to normalcy now that the Cold War is over, and therefore if you can argue that we can go back to the old rules and the old customs, that should be the solution in the eyes of many people. But in the past dozen or so years, the world has changed so much, requiring a new types and new degrees of efforts. We cannot not just reinstitute old set of rules to the present situation and then blame people for different wrongdoings or omissions. So the accurate perception of the changes that have taken place in the last decade or two is very, very urgently needed. What should the politicians or state political leadership do? Let me give it some thought. First, what are real problems? That is first what we must first think about. What are the real problems? A real problem must be an important one. Second, a real problem must be something practical, pragmatic, that you can do something practical about it. Like American criticism of Japan. Let's take it as an example. The Japanese agriculture should be opened. So goes the argument. Agricultural security or food independence cannot be founded. So goes the argument. I think this argument is in error. I don't think it is such a crucially important matter in terms of the deficit. I don't really subscribe to that agricultural independence argument that Japan needs to be independent food-wise. But it is true that every country in the government pays some subsidies for its agricultural production. And from the viewpoint of fairness of subsidies, this problem may be solved. Economically, it is not so important as it is portrayed, and yet it generates such major psychological repercussions when people overseas complain of Japanese agricultural closeness. Why is it? We are only taking up we have been taking up only the visible symptoms without really evaluating the magnitude of the problems. Now, suppose if we take up more important problems, can they be solved? I'm now raising the question of feasibility of a solution. Some of the most important problems